No, it takes a little bit. So, hello to everybody who is watching us live or who may be tuning in later for this. Obviously, we're going to need to wait for some people to jump on here since we are running about 4 minutes late. Um, Honestly, we were outside jumping on the trampoline and I didn't know what time it was. So,
That's
uh,
so fun.
yeah, it was cool. We made up Foursquare on the trampoline. We played Mike in the middle. We threw some fits. Um, all of the above.
That's a good time.
Yeah,
What
that's
did
pretty.
now? How did Star Wars? Like, have you guys only watched episode 4 now in your house? Has there been more?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a little bit. It's usually they're big on watching episodes of things, so we're pretty glued into the Amazing Race constantly now.
Nice.
Um, and then if it's not that, then I don't know. Like Arden just doesn't want to watch movies anymore. But we've been also when Kyler finishes a Harry Potter book now that they're sharing that, we'll go watch that movie all together.
Yeah.
Um, so it may take us a little bit to get to Empire Strikes Back, but I'll force it in somehow or another. Maybe this Saturday.
There's a very famous family story from when our parents decided to sit down, all three of us, and show us Star Wars. It was like they waited until Patrick was old enough to understand, so they held it back from me and Allie. And so when we finished Empire, Luke, Han Solo's frozen in carbonite, and so it's
Okay.
very stressful for fans of Han Solo. And so I remember I looked at my mom and I was like, "We have to watch the next one right now." And she looked at me, and my mother did not raise her voice against us often, but she said, "I had to wait 2 years. You can wait 24 hours."
That's funny.
The big quote. And it was like right as episode 3 was coming out, which at the time was going to be the last Star Wars movie ever. And so we
Uh-huh.
saw 4, 5, 6, 1, 2 at home, and then went and saw 3, which was the first one that was PG-13, and we were all definitely under the age of 13. So here are my two parents walking in 3 kids to see Star Wars, and it was fantastic.
That's awesome. Yeah, the apparently the first Star Wars movie I ever saw, or no, what could have been the first movie that I ever went and saw in the movie theater as a kid could have been Return of the Jedi at 6 months old, but instead my mom took me to see Annie while my brother took my dad to see Return of the Jedi. So,
That's good. It's
like,
a good moment.
granted, I wouldn't have remembered any of it, but I could have said that I saw Return of the Jedi in
Like
theaters
you were
live.
6 months. Oh
Um,
my
so anyway,
goodness.
hey, welcome to everybody. If you're here, check in with us. We want to know who's here, and we're glad you're here this evening. Hopefully, your week is going well, and you are healthy and safe and thriving. So yeah, check in. Let us know that you're here before we're gonna probably kill another minute and a half or two to before we dive into Micah chapter 2, just because people tend to um, follow the same patterns that they follow in worship, and they show up, 8 to 10 minutes late, which is, you know what? We're gonna get to the grace part of Micah. We'll be here for we're in judgment right now, so I get to say all sorts of judgmental things while we're doing Micah chapter 1 and 2.
If this is your first time to join us, that's not true.
Hey, Jake.
And Gay Kaiser, oh, I'm so glad you found it. We were emailing back and forth today about links to this, and so glad that she's here. I've been very impressed with how many of our people have worked so hard to figure out so many different kinds of technology between Facebook Live and Zoom, and who knows what else we're going to end up using before, or right now media, like all of the
Right.
things.
Yeah, it has been
So,
really refreshing and inspiring to see people who are just like determined and dogged to do this.
yeah,
Now that it seems like what Dallas is now until May 15th, is that the
May 15th. Yep.
awesome? So yeah, Collin County's getting ready to start phasing in opening stuff. I just read, so we'll see what happens on Monday when Governor Abbott tells us what's going on. But all right, here we go. Nancy Greer, Kathy Bradford, Kat, Carrie Robertson. We're glad you are in the house. And here's Sean McCafferty. What is it? We'll see how long I can stick on tonight, but I liked Micah. Well, we're glad
Very
you're in the
sweet.
house. That is very nice. The problem with this, though, is that Sean cannot show you all the awesome Zoom backgrounds that he had for the lay leadership meeting.
Oh man, that was the most that will go down in history. I'll tell that story in clergy meetings. Like, what was the most fun you had in the pandemic? And I will say Zoom calls with Sean McCafferty and his Baby Yoda background.
And with the Walking Dead walking toward him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So incredible. Yeah, I don't know about you. Like, this is fun, but I'm starting to get like Zoom fatigue or like zoomed out. And I've seen a couple of articles on that, which has been interesting. So the fun backgrounds make it less draining.
You're right.
So.
Yeah, Jacob Fields, we're glad you're here. Yeah, I because I'm so used to just having all of us in the same office and being like around each other, like having to intentionally schedule meetings is draining for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, having to and like hearing all the background noise that's going on and either thinking, okay, great, I want to be like a part of that, or like I am trying to hide even more from that. Either one, it's just kind of it's an interesting balance. So
yeah.
Kathy Bradford, if you don't know who Baby Yoda is, you can go watch the show The Mandalorian, which is a Star Wars world or Star Wars universe show that takes place after Return of the Jedi and before The Force Awakens.
This episode is actually being sponsored by Disney. Since we've talked so much about Star Wars, we should get like a lifetime supply of something around here.
I think so. If everybody will just comment in your favorite Disney princess, I bet we'll get some free whatever from Disney.
Favorite Disney princess. Does Baby Yoda count as a Disney princess at this point, though?
I mean, probably.
A little bit damsel in distress. Like, I could make the argument.
Okay, I think Kathy knows what it is. Maybe just not making the connection. Ellen Reese, we're glad
she was gonna leave. Kathy was gonna leave Bible study to go start The Mandalorian. That's what I was afraid of.
I wouldn't blame her. It is a great show.
Oh my goodness.
All right, why don't we dive into Micah? So for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, this is we're trying to make this as interactive as possible and encourage you to comment along, ask questions, make comments. We'll do our best to stop and ask questions along the way to give you some prompts for that, and then talk with each other, talk with us. We're in chapter 2 of Micah. We started last week. Just if you missed it, the intro to who Micah is he's kind of a prophet from the sticks. A lot of the other major prophets, hey Tom, a lot of the other major prophets were kind of like official prophets, like Elijah or Elisha or Isaiah or Nathan or those kind. And Micah really is this guy from the sticks who has a beef with just all the bad stuff going on. So we got introduced to a little bit of all the bad stuff going on. Right. Most scholars would say that that the prophecy or this book or his ministry comes right before the Assyrian army takes over the northern kingdom of Israel. But we also mentioned there are lots of allusions to the exile in Babylon. So it's probably a book that people went and found meaning in while they were getting exiled and kind of slid in some sentences here or there, which tends to happen. And it makes it all the more meaningful to show how the story of God and the story of Scripture keeps getting reimagined, or people find meaning in something from the past, make it their own, and then we come along as well and find meaning in that and reimagine it as well. So, Jenny, we're glad you're here.
I have a question actually for everyone to answer based off what you're talking about.
Yeah.
To help get us started. So, to your point that this was something that people were reading and finding meaning and finding inspiration from while they were in exile, even though it was possibly written before that time, or it's a warning about that time. So obviously there's no song or play or movie or book that's been written about COVID yet, right?
Right.
So my question that I want everyone to comment is like, what is like a song or a movie or a piece of art or something that you're turning to that you're finding meaning in right now, whether it's related to this idea of global pandemic and disaster or not? Like what is something that you're taking in culture that's was maybe done or created in the past, but you're finding meaning and inspiration from right now?
That's a really great question.
I just came up with it.
Yeah, no, I'd love this. I can't wait to see everybody's responses for that. Oddly enough, you had talked several times about the Dear Evan Hansen song "You Will Be Found," and I never really bothered to listen to it. I hadn't listened to the soundtrack, but then James Corden did that thing where he brought everybody on, and I'm completely obsessed with the song now. And it's one of those things of like, okay, when I'm feeling isolated and everything seems turned upside down, something about like listening to this cast sing a song about togetherness is just a mood lifter for me. Jacob Fields, I'm with you on that.
Fields, yes.
My 8-year-old is obsessed with Frozen 2, and so we watched it a bunch. And Lost in the Woods, not so much, but the Show Yourself is her favorite song. And like I've literally gotten into it to where I'll listen to music while I'm playing video games, and I'll be playing soccer or Madden football or something, and that song will come on the shuffle play, and I'm like jamming while I'm playing football. It's kind of funny.
Although I do like the Panic at the Disco cover of Into the Unknown.
That is good.
But Panic was like my like middle school soundtrack for just like angst in general. So I've been going back to a lot of, that's what I've been enjoying actually, is music that I enjoyed when I was in middle school. It's really tragic, like angsty, like too much eyeliner, straight hair version of Carrie Lynn. But I'm proud, it's a badge I'm proud to wear. And so like Mayday Parade, Panic at the Disco has been kind of on a like constant like angsty repeat. Because there's just, for me, like music takes me back to certain places and back to certain feelings. And so some of the angst and the pent upness I think that teenagers feel when that whole cycle of life is happening is a great way that I can compare this isolation and social distancing, quarantine, whatever word I'm supposed to use right now. So
this may be a study in the Enneagram, because you're going for angsty music and I'm looking at like Disney and Broadway and like what can make me just feel wonderful right now?
What's gonna make everyone happy? And I'm like, I feel anxious. Everything is.
You gotta study in like, what psalm do you regularly go to? Do you go to Psalm 22 or Psalm 23?
Oh, or is it 67? That's like, where are you at, God? Like,
right.
That's the one I might go to more often.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Keep on. Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying, yeah. Keep on coming. We'd love to know what's getting you through, like a movie or music, or what is it that you've returned to and found meaning in during this experience. And so we're gonna. I think let's go ahead and get into Micah 2, since we're about 13 minutes in, and we're grateful for the 15 of y'all that are chimed in. And Carrie Lynn's going to lead us through Micah 2 tonight. So let's get going with it.
Okay. So typical deal, I've divided us into kind of some smaller sections to take in. We reviewed last week, but for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, so the way in which you take in listening through the Hamilton soundtrack is very different than the way in which you take in listening to a Panic at the Disco album. They're both music and they're both of a certain, time period, but you take them in differently when you listen to them. So it's the same with biblical literature. The way in which we read Philippians, a letter from Paul to a church community, is very different than the way in which we read Micah, which is prophetic literature. And today, I think we're going to see how some of the language can be really confusing with just a surface level taking in of what it's saying. And so there's a couple of other pieces here that are going to talk about using more metaphors and using more common language that is not translated always in the best way. But one of the commentaries I read on this kind of painted Micah as this picture of a courtroom scene. So if you're looking for something to visualize in your mind, if you're a big Law and Order fan, like you just picture in your mind, you've got one side, you've got Micah, and the other side, you've got these people of the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. And this kind of courtroom drama really unfolds here in chapter 2. There's a little bit more back and forth. So we're going to start with verses 1 through 3. And I'm reading again from the NRSV. So if you've got that in front of you, if you've got a different version in front of you and something is worded differently in a way that's helpful, we'd love for you to share that in the comments as well. So this is Micah chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Alas for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord, now I am devising against this family an evil from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk hotly, for it will be an evil time. So this is kind of this opening section is Micah kind of unfolding this courtroom scene and this judgment that's coming upon these people. So when it says that these people devise wickedness and they and evil deeds on their beds, it's this idea of like they go to bed at night thinking about the evil things that they're going to do. There's Monkey for his nightly appearance. This cracks me up so much.
I do not like closed doors.
That's very metaphorical. So anyway, so these people are plotting evil before they even go to bed at night, right? There is no like accidental sin here. There is no, oh, I didn't know that this was wrong. These people are planning what they're going to do before they go to sleep at night, and it's wrong. In verse 2, it says they covet fields and seize them. And this is something that, remember, do not covet is the 10th commandment in the 10 commandments. But they're not just coveting what's in front of them, but they see what they want it, and then they take it. And so then God comes in and says that there's going to be there's devising against this family of evil. And so this is another section that David talked about last week. What we see here, and the way to interpret this is, what does God think about the evil that's being done? So going back to the evil that they're doing, they're coveting and they're seizing, they're sitting in their bed and they're coming up with the evil things that they're going to do, reminded me a lot of one of our general rules for the Methodist tradition, and it's do no harm. And that's one thing that in a lot of discussions with Methodists I'm with will always say, well, this is the option that does the least amount of harm. So my question for people to comment to, but David, for you to answer, is how would you interpret the phrase do no harm for us today, both in a world where we're in a global pandemic and also like just normally, whenever normal was or is or will ever be. But how would you answer that kind of in both contexts?
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder. I think, I go to that place. I showed it in a sermon one time, and we've talked about it in the show The Good Place, where they look at the point system of the bad place and the good place and realize, like, whatever, 50 years or 100 years ago or something, you just went and bought flowers for somebody and it was a good action. And then all of a sudden we learned, like, well, that flowers are non-organically processed and exploit the workers and therefore put people in poverty. And so by the act of buying flowers might be like 20 good points, but it actually equals like 75 bad points. So it becomes a negative action because of what you've done in the world to not create harm. So I think the more that we've gone global and the more that we're connected with each other, the harder it is to just purely do perfectly good. And I think that's where God judges based on intentions. But I think when I look at do no harm during like COVID-19, a big deal is, and I'm going to put this in context of a conversation I saw on Facebook of, somebody saying it's better to lose X amount of people than like double X amount of people losing their jobs. And so it's kind of the economy thing. And there's a lot of, there's harm being done by not allowing people to go to work, but what's the risk and harm? Who do you choose? I suppose, do you choose people to lose their house and job, or do you choose people to die or get really sick and have the medical debt after that? So I do think it's a really hard balance given the political and economic nature of our world. But if I had to like really narrow it down, is that when I do no harm, it's I want everybody to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And so therefore I'm not going to do anything that will take that away from somebody. And I look at, there's another passage in Isaiah that, like Isaiah 5 something or other, I remember just kind of randomly, that says kind of the same thing about you go from house to house and you go from field to field until there's no one left but you. And so therefore I think, do no harm is making sure that the entire world doesn't revolve around you and your desires, and you're willing to sacrifice anybody to get there. Do no harm is, I really want to put my neighbor first to make sure that they can stand on their own 2 feet for that.
Yeah. And Gay, to your comment that you just posted, I totally agree with you. And I think that's what is really particularly interesting about this section. I think the prophets get a bad rap, and I think sometimes we think that there's like two gods of the Bible. We think that there's a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes in some Christian circles, people think that grace didn't exist until Jesus died on the cross, and that's just not true. So you bring up a great point of it's totally about intention, right? And that's why this point in verse 1 is really interesting, because these people are intending to do evil. They're literally plotting it like it's the last thing they think about before they go to sleep. And I don't know what the last thing you think about before you go to sleep is, but mine is not how I'm going to take people's stuff because I want it. But these people, I mean, that's what they were focused on. That was their idol. That was what they were doing. So Gay, I really appreciate that comment, because, we talk about like sins that we commit that we don't know about. I believe they're called sins of omission. And John Wesley had these kind of it may not have been John Wesley, somebody in the Methodist world that we learned about in seminary had this as a classification of sins that we might commit, but we don't know. Like you buy a t-shirt that was unethically made, right? We don't know that. And so the do no harm absolutely fits in with intention. So that's a great point that she brings up.
So Kristen, let me ask you about this. I'm thinking about these people who are lying awake at night plotting about how to like devise systems of inequity against the poor and how to go steal people's land and, basically credit sharks, loan sharks, if you will. We're all born into systems and environments that we can't help but learn from what we've experienced. And so if somebody is born into, I'm thinking of the movie Wall Street with Charlie Sheen, and he's born into this kind of attitude of greed. Gordon Gekko, greed is good, and born into this world of excess. So the only lesson he's ever learned is tank somebody else to make your own money. And so his intent is to go tank somebody else, but that's the only virtue he's ever learned. So that's where, what do you think about, I guess, God's positioning in terms of intention on clearly, and if you've never seen the movie, but I don't know if you know, but clearly their intent in that is to go tank somebody else's business so they can make money, which we would consider wrong. But is it omission because they've never heard the gospel or, never really read Micah and figured out, so what do you think?
That's a difficult, who are you, the board of ordained ministry right now? No, it's a great question.
I got invited. I got to decide if I'm going to do it or not. So, the letter officially came.
Practice.
Yeah, this is practice.
No, this is a great question because it's, I remember as a kid, always being so afraid of the specifics when it came to sin and when it came to grace. So I'm finding a roundabout big way to answer your question of, even if blank, there is enough grace for all, right? I can just remember I had a really misconstructed view of sin and grace for a long time that it was almost Catholic, which is super weird. I was afraid I had to repent for every sin I've committed since the last time I've repented, or I wasn't going to heaven anymore. And I can remember just as a 10-year-old, praying every night, God, if I forgot to ask for forgiveness for anything I did wrong, I'm really sorry. Total anxiety, total panic. And that's not the way I don't do that anymore. I am sorry for the things I've done wrong. So yeah, I mean, I think even in a situation where a person who doesn't know any better is doing harm, in a way in which they may not see what they're doing as harm, there is still enough grace to cover that situation. And Micah gets there with these people, right? Like, not today, but Micah gets there. And again, that's a very Methodist cop out about grace, but I'm going to hold to it.
Well, that's what I appreciate Methodist theology for, is the grace, because, you know, when I look at how the law developed in the Old Testament, it was very much like, okay, we have these core rules, but they don't really cover everything. So we're going to make very specific rules about the donkey that falls in the pit and yada, yada, yada. And I feel like modern day churches have tried to do similar things to nail sin down to a T. And it's just not, I mean, like Wendy made a great comment about earth, and, you know, it's, there's a lot, I mean, honestly, unless, you know, the economy shifted to a more natural energy sources and stuff. I mean, like, even though oil is down right now, like there's a lot of systemic things at play that we just have no idea that we're contributing to. And the more educated we get, the more frustrating life gets, I feel.
Yeah.
On
well,
so,
it goes back to the good place concept, right? Of buying flowers for your grandma has become no longer a good thing because of all of the sub questions that come after it. So yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I mean, so what's really, you know, what's happening historically here is that it literally is, I don't know if you want to call it title max or if you want to call it mortgage lending, or bad mortgage, you know, subprime mortgages, and then buying people's debt up. But they are legitimately going and swindling in the courts the poor people to take their land and then charge the poor people to work on their own land that they just took from them, which is an age-old practice we see in medieval history and we see today and various other things as well. So this is, you know, we're talking about big systems. I think it's important to mention grace in there. I think it's also important to just go ahead and name that, like, I think the way you put it is like, these guys are going to sleep figuring out, how can I Scrooge McDuck somebody tomorrow?
And that's like the only agenda item, right? Like that's all that they're doing. So I've got one more question in this section for us. And if people want to keep commenting, all of these are super great. So the question I have is, how do you interpret the commandment, do not covet, in a modern context? So I'm going to mention The West Wing probably twice tonight because I've restarted watching it. Now that I'm watching Sports Night, I'm on a very weird Aaron Sorkin kick. So there's a really funny walk and talk on The West Wing very early where Rob Lowe's character is walking through, and there's this community in Alabama that wants to abolish all laws except for the 10th commandment. And the chief of staff looks at him and says, well, do not covet is going to be a really hard one to enforce. Like, how do you do that? And he goes, right, because if I was under trial for not coveting, I'd probably bear false witness to get out of it. So the question I have is, what does the commandment do not covet mean in a modern context? And I think maybe for some of you commenting, but for you, David, too, like, why do you think, I think the commandments that are in the Big Ten are not like more important than the others, but I do think it shows like a prioritization of what God wants from God's people. And so there's some really important commandments about how we engage with God and how we engage with other people in the Big Ten. So why do you think do not covet was added to the list?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the 10 Commandments are kind of the basis for everything else. That, like the rest of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, come out of one part of those. I think it's, I mean, honestly, I think it's on there because it kind of leads to the rest. I mean, if I had to pick a starting place outside of "You shall have no other gods before me," I would pick "You shall not covet," because I think coveting has to do with pride, which then leads to adultery, which then leads to murder, you know, so I think it's in there because this is where I think Jesus speaks so strongly on when he says, like, okay, you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, and it's not enough just to not sleep with her. It's like, you should cut your eye out if you're even thinking about that. because when we want something, it eventually will take over. And I'm thinking, and this is just a small random example, but like I have these knockoff AirPods that were only like $29 a year and a half ago. And of course they don't work very well, and they don't work at all anymore. So I'm constantly on like Best Buy's website trying to find the perfect set of AirPods, and I'm not pulling the trigger, but it's all I'm thinking about when I'm looking at my phone. And so I know eventually I don't need them. I have other headphones, but I want them. And so eventually I'll probably give in and get these. And it's largely, I forget about it until like I get on a video chat with you and you've got your AirPods in. And
Right.
I'm thinking, oh my gosh, those look so much easier than my like wired junk that's all getting in the way. And so the more that I see it, the more that I think about it, the more I want it. And so when we start coveting other things, it becomes this replacement for our happiness and our joy. And I think Penny has this great. Yeah. I mean, Jenny says coveting leads to greed. Penny, take your eyes off God. I mean, I really think, I mean,
like I have had some major coveting of anybody who has a yard right now. Because I am in my tiny box of an apartment, and like I will totally confess, like if you have a yard and you've been posting about it on Facebook, I've been grumbling. Especially in a minute with
sorry about that.
It's fine. I'm just being honest. Like, but everybody wants what they can't have, right? Like, an even sillier example. So when I was in middle school, everyone who had curly hair, like me, straightened it because we wanted to have straight hair. And everybody who had straight hair was curling it. And we were all spending hours to have exactly what we did not have naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't that straight hair was cooler than curly hair. It's just you did what you didn't have. You wanted what you couldn't have. And it's like a really silly example with hair that still rings true to this day, right? And you're right, like coveting can be such a slippery slope to so many other things. Yeah, that's a great point. So
one of the best things I ever kind of heard about finding what the peace of Christ means is accepting that everything God gave you is what you were supposed to have. And not in terms of material possessions, but kind of like the color of your hair and how big your ears are and whatever else that might mean for you. And I think as a middle schooler, that is really hard to accept, especially like, someone like me who wasn't in the popular crowd. It's really hard to accept. But the more that I have been able to grow into just recognizing that not only physical characteristics, but spiritual and emotional and personality characteristics, the more that I've been able to grow and like just kind of not want to be somebody else, the more that I'm able to just like sit in a room and be okay with myself and realize that God is with me.
Yeah. I mean, just to share like my personal, so like and it goes back to hair, but this is what we're doing on Bible study tonight is we're talking about Star Wars and hair.
And music, don't forget.
And honestly, this is who I am. This is what happens when I lead. But my first year of seminary, and my friend David's watching, so he can attest to this. My first year of seminary, I was still straightening my hair. And it was probably like halfway through that first year, I decided to just embrace my curly hair. And I like haven't not had a single day where it's been straight since. And that became a very spiritual practice of like appreciating and learning to take care of what God gave me, right? Like the image of God that's within me is curly hair. And like you said, like I'm able to sit in a room and be the kid in there with curly hair and people love it and always want to touch it, which is weird, and ask me what shampoo I'm using. And but it leads to, and it's such a big part of like me now and my personality. Like people who've known me since then can't imagine me with straight hair. And it's become something that has become a very spiritual experience of like embracing the image of God that's within me and the way that God created me, which is different from a lot of people around me. And so like, it's a really silly example, and yet it helped me defeat my coveting of other people's hair.
Right. I see Penny's comment that it's so much easier too. And I was thinking, when you get ordained and they ask you to vow that you will not trifle away time, like straightening your hair was got to take hours. And think of all the Jesus work you could be doing.
That's true. It's going to be perfect for those ordination vows. I'll think exactly of that when it happens.
That's right. I think, just wrapping it back into Micah and these creditors and everything, I think, it'd be kind of an interesting fly on the wall moment if they're jealous of like the poor people's happiness in their own void, or if they're jealous of like the next rich guy. And so they're going to exploit somebody else they can't beat that person monetarily or physically. So they're going to go exploit somebody weaker. And so they can jump the gun over that person there. But yeah, I assume, go back to, I think coveting really leads to the harm that we cause people, even if it's not the actual person we're coveting against.
Yeah. So. Okay, we're going to move on to verses 4 and 5 now. So I'll read them. So it says, on that day, they shall take up a taunt song against you, and wail with bitter lamentation and say, we are utterly ruined. The Lord alters the inheritance of my people, how he removes it from me. Among our captors, he parcels out our fields. Therefore, you will have no one to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. Okay, so this is another one of those places where the language can get very confusing. So basically, like if I had to sum up verse 4, it's the tables have turned. And the big old commentary that I read says that some of the best translation of the Hebrew is like almost a play on words here. And so it's supposed to say like, the sobbing shall be sobbed, like those who caused crying and lamenting. And like lament in a Hebrew, like Old Testament context is not a quiet process.
No.
Lamenting was something where you would walk down the street and you could see what somebody was wearing and what was on their forehead that they were lamenting, and it was crying at the edge of the city when somebody was lamenting. So it's not just like, oh, the tables are going to turn and it's not going to be pretty for you, but it changed it to listen, like this is not going to go well for those of you who have been doing harm. Those who took over will be taken over. And I think this is a very interesting point of it's a proportional response. Like the evil that has been done is going to be met with this judgment and this punishment that's coming, to quote another West Wing episode. So I went 2 for 2 there. So casting lots, for anybody who's looking at verse 5, casting lots was a way that was used to divide territory. But I think what's interesting in this piece here is Micah is saying, like, we'll cast lots, but the land is going to be so destroyed that there'll be no territory to divide anyways. So what I wanted to ask, and this is going to be really interesting in the comments, so I hope that people will put in their thoughts, but what do you think that these verses show us about God's attitude towards injustice?
Yeah, I'd love to know what people are thinking, because again, so y'all are getting seminary conversations tonight on really big topics like sin and grace and systemic sin and personal sin and sins of omission, and like this is not.
That was just in the first 30 minutes.
Yeah, that was like most Bible studies you watch on Right Now Media or otherwise are not getting into like the biggest things here. It's more usually around personal sin, and so this goes to me, and I have some issues with it, but like liberation theology, if for those of you who don't know, is people like Oscar Romero and I can't remember who was the actual, like James Cone, and I can't remember who was the actual like beginning person. Gustavo Gutierrez, I believe, is one of the people. Came out of Latin America primarily, and it was this idea that God is always on the side of the oppressed, and that God will, when we look at the prophets and we look at the Old Testament, God is always siding with the little guy and making sure that they rise to the ability. And what it's looked like in history often, though, is a rebellion or a revolution, and it's the only way to rise to the level of your oppressors is to conquer and defeat them, which usually then makes them the oppressed, and the cycle just keeps on going. So I do, and it's passages like this that give liberation theologists their meat of, look,
you get a lot of stuff from prophets.
Yeah, like God's going to turn the tables, and you're going to know what this feels like. And quite honestly, Jesus, in the story about Lazarus and the rich man, when Lazarus gets to go to basically heaven and the rich man gets to go to hell, and the rich man's like, just let Lazarus dip his finger in water and put it on my tongue, I'm suffering. And Jesus flat out tells him, you already had it on earth. Now is your comeuppance. So there is a, like, I don't know, like for whatever reason, being a preacher, it's weird that I get uncomfortable speaking for God, but I really do find I find that God has a severe distaste for injustice in the world, and there's no part of the Bible that you will convince me doesn't have some element of power and justice involved in it, to where all of God's children are supposed to stand on be able to carry their own dignity.
Yeah, I think that brings a really good point, and this is again where Wesleyan theology, I think, comes into play with what we believe, like alongside liberation theology when it comes to things like injustice, because a Wesleyan would say that there is grace for the oppressor as well. And I think what we see here in this is, and we get to it, like we get to the grace part. Like, I know we are really holding it out for everyone watching. And there is. And I think that's another turning of the table, right? And it doesn't mean that what happened to the oppressed isn't still wrong. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do no harm. But we talk about, and again, we're going seminary today. I'm that typical seminary grad who can't do not seminary today. But we talk about streams of theology when we're in seminary. So I don't subscribe to just one camp.
Right.
I've got like 4 streams of theology that come together. And this for me is where my subscription to liberation theology combines with Wesleyan theology and this big grace that covers a lot of different things. So yeah, that's my like 2 cents on that piece.
Yeah. When do you say, is this why some religious groups see honor in suffering as if it's a blessing? I think so, Penny. Yeah. I think that there's 2 sides to that. One, they see, so if you look at like a Catholic nun or a priest who deprives themselves, some of that is consistently living in lament and consistently living in a posture of humility so that they don't end up coveting or don't end up, obviously that hadn't worked out so well for some of the Catholic Church, but so they do live in a situation of lament to keep themselves humble before God and to experience the plight of the oppressed so that they can serve with the oppressed. Another part of that, another part of the suffering aspect is just claiming that we're suffering when we're really not suffering. And the best example I can think of is like the pastors in Louisiana, Florida, and otherwise who are talking about the United States government cracking down and trying to take over churches because they're asking them to close for the human good of not dying, and seeing that as a threat. And so, and that's a lot of the letters of Paul that consistently talk about that you're going to suffer for the gospel, because in ancient Rome, you literally would get killed if you were a Christian.
They really did suffer.
Yeah, they really did suffer. So I think some people do suffer because they want to, like Shane Claiborne at The Simple Way is a good example of somebody who makes his own clothes and lives in kind of intentional poverty to resonate and serve people well. Then there's people who just claim they're suffering because they just want to be the chosen people, and the chosen people are supposed to suffer according to Paul. So they kind of make up their own suffering.
Yeah, I think that again, an ancient document trying to fit into a modern context can get really problematic very quickly, right? And I think just like a shout out to the way in which this like Bible study has been working. I think David and I very carefully interpret texts when we bring them to you all at Creekwood, whether it's through this medium or through preaching, whatever it is that we do on Sunday mornings. I couldn't come up with the word preaching. I've got like pandemic, like cloudy brain from isolation. But we're very careful about the way that we interpret things. And I think we even recognize that, like, I read like my big like thesis from seminary the other day, because I had a friend who needed some help with hers. And there were pieces in it that I was disagreeing with. And I only wrote it like 2 years ago. And so I think this is just a point to bring up to, like, this is a difficult document to interpret, and it can certainly be interpreted in ways that can be harmful, especially when it comes to talking about suffering and influencing that into our modern context. So I'm really glad that question was brought up.
I want to say a word to Carrie here. First, Wendy, you're going to have to give me more context about the original distribution of Canaan by Lot, because I'm only familiar with Lot and Abraham looking at each other and saying, this isn't big enough for the both of us, so you go left and I'll go right. Maybe that's what you're talking to, but I think what Micah is talking about is like the casting lots, because that's what they use to divide land. That
was just a common, like, contextual thing. Like, non-Hebrews did that, like, as a way of dividing land.
Yeah. So to
Carrie.
Yeah, Carrie, you said you're starting to feel guilty about being blessed, which is something that I've suffered from my entire, not entire life. I went to TCU and I loved being blessed, and I loved everything that I grew up with, because I grew up in Fairview, and the same thing about Fairview that's true today was true back then. So we grew up in a very charmed existence, and it wasn't until I went to seminary and I started studying some of these things, I was living around people who are preaching these same things and talking about these same things, that I started to really regret my history and all the things that, like, my parents had done for me, and really living this charmed life, and still living this charmed life. So I had to overcome that, and kind of came to one of the conclusions of, I could get rid of everything and live amongst the poor, and I could probably do just fine, but I also then become a problem for somebody else to take care of instead of working hard. I mean, God blessed us with the idea of work, and work is part of a spiritual discipline and practice to contribute to being stewards of the earth. And so doing that, and we participate in an economy, and sure, economies are man-made, but I think as long as we're blessed, but we're blessed ethically, and that we are good stewards of what we are blessed with. And so, like, I'd even use the example, a lot of people are and I may cause some ruckus with this, but a lot of people speak badly against CEOs for making so much money. And a lot of that's in stock options that they don't just have in their bank account. And there's a whole bunch of dynamics about it. But basically, if someone came and said to you, hey, I'm going to pay you $30 million to run this company and give everyone jobs and expand this really, really well, there's a way you can take that, do your job ethically, and use the money ethically, and be blessed to be a blessing. And I look at Bill Gates, for example, who has done innumerable amounts of good, at least post-retirement maybe, with his success and what he's been able to do. So I don't think that being blessed is a problem. I think that God told Abraham that he was blessed to be a blessing. And so recognize that whatever we get, whether it's somebody handing us $30 million or experiencing just the beauty of God bringing me 2 wonderful children and a great wife, understanding that is given to me, and I get to be a steward of that for the blessing of the world. So I don't think we need to, one of the things we're not saying in here is that we have to feel guilty for having a house and a car or 2 cars and air conditioning and a 65-inch flat screen TV kind of thing. So it's just the difference between, like, the people that Carrie Lynn was reading about at first are waking up figuring out how they can hurt people to get more, versus waking up and thinking, how do I do my job in which I'm going to get rewarded? And then how do I use my rewards to bless the world around me. So I hope that's some pastoral care for you, Carrie.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jacob had to go, but he brought up a good point that I think failed to continue to make in my larger point. Was talking about John Wesley would say that God was not excluding an oppressor from grace, but the question would be, if an oppressor claims faith in Jesus Christ but continues to oppress knowingly, that becomes a problem. And again, we're in like very deep theological territory here. So this is super fun. It's like seminary all over again, which is great. You all are so brilliant. So yeah, and even Katrina brings up a really great point of we do what we can. We talked about one of the general rules earlier of do no harm, but the other one is do only good, right? And so we do good with what we have. We are learning so much right now in this pandemic to do the best we can with what we have, right? And I keep saying that to David when I talk about our live stream on Sunday mornings. But even like this, leading a Bible study from our separate homes, we're doing the best we can with what we have. And I would say the same would be for the things in your life that you have blessings. I don't think you should feel bad for having a wonderful family, but you do good with that family. You shouldn't feel bad for having a house and a backyard right now, but you do good with that house and that backyard. And I think that there's so many creative ways, especially upcoming when we're talking about reopening and things like that, that those of you with yards will be throwing some like backyard parties with 10 people or less or something like that in the coming weeks and months. So don't sell your houses with the nice yards because we're going to need them to do good very soon.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we also always talk, I mean, granted, money makes the world go round, and it has since money, currency and trading existed. We could say the same thing about, I'm just trying to think of it. You could say the same thing about, like, if you have a really, really best friend that you've just been blessed with, who is your life mate to run alongside of, and I'm here just theoretically with no one, then you wouldn't want to give up your best friend that you've been blessed with just because you want to be in solidarity with me. You might want to include me in that. And so if you're someone who's blessed with money, it's okay, well, how do I include somebody in their ability to also earn and care for the world? And, how do I give them the opportunity to bless? And I remember when I was an associate pastor, the church I was at took this men's retreat. It was a Sunday school class, took a men's retreat, and we went canoeing on the Brazos, and which was
men's retreats are so cool. I'm just gonna say that
I need to find a time to lead one of these because it was great. We camped out in the middle of the river. It was awesome. But people were constantly coming up to I was in a canoe that year. I was in a kayak next year, but in a canoe, people would come up, catch up to us, and ask me some biblical question they were thinking of. And I think one time I said the word social justice to somebody who we would normally stereotype as right wing comes politically. And as soon as I said that buzzword, it instantly triggered this vomiting reflex for him. And he looked at me with dead eyes, and he said, "What does that mean to you?" And when I said that I truly believe it's the invitation God gives for everybody to be able to live out the gifts that God has given them, and that's what I truly believe, and to make sure that our systems don't hold people down from using who they're supposed to be and what they can contribute. And it was funny because he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, okay, yeah, I can get on board with that." I was like, "Oh, okay, it's all in the matter of semantics, I guess." So.
Oh, Steve Batchelor is in on your men's retreat idea.
Telling you what, the Brazos calling my name.
All right, we need to move on. So we're going to do verses 6 through 7 now. So it says, "Do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Should this be said, O house of Jacob? Is the Lord's patience exhausted? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to one who walks uprightly?" So again, if we're in our courtroom drama, this is where the people are responding to Micah, and basically they say, "Hey, your message is making me feel a little bit bad about myself. Can you stop? Could you not, please?" they want the prophet to stop speaking. They want him to stop preaching. So I found a hilarious Twitter thread this week. For those of you who are Twitter savvy, somebody tweeted, I have to find it and read it, so pardon my phone during Bible study. But it's somebody who asked on Twitter, what's the weirdest sermon you've ever heard? And some of them are not appropriate to read out loud over the internet while my mom is watching. But they are hysterical because there are so many like horrendous sermons out there.
Crazy.
And
It's crazy. I've been through the thread. It's nuts.
it's hilarious. Like there's somebody who preached about Job on Christmas morning when Christmas morning fell on a Sunday. It was this whole idea like about Job and suffering on Christmas morning, which had nothing to do with Jesus being like it never made the turn to Jesus being born. So the question I have for us from this is one, I would love to hear if you've heard any very strange sermons recently. If they're from David, you can't say that, but you can text me later.
No, feel free. Yeah, go ahead. I want to know.
But if there's any weird sermons you've heard in your life, but also David as a preacher and as a person who's not afraid to be vulnerable over the internet now, what's a message that you don't like to preach or a message that you don't like to hear?
Probably, well, it's funny. The message I don't like to preach are probably the same messages these people are saying, this makes us feel bad. I get hives the night before I have to get up and speak about whether, like racism or classism or anything, and like, I don't mind asking for money for God's ministry. Like, I feel like I've gotten really comfortable with that and enjoy it to some extent. But when I have to talk about income disparity in, like Carrie said he's starting to feel bad about being blessed. And if you drive around anywhere in Collin County, save a few areas of maybe Princeton, Princeton's getting pretty nice now. East McKinney, certain, Central Frisco, some of those areas. Everybody's, the income inequity between that and like Dallas County is pretty large. So I get uncomfortable because I love this area. I grew up in this area. I see a lot of good happening in this area, and we are able to bless a lot of people in this area. So I don't want people to get the wrong idea of what God is saying. And then most of the time when people hear conversations about how we should treat the poor, we either minimalize it to a food drive so we can help them over there, or they double down on they go against their guilt, and instead they just get mad that like they have every right to a $3 million house, and how dare I question the inequity or anything like that. So I think the social justice kind of sermons I don't like to give, but what's funny is I love to hear them because I have this personality.
That works out for you.
Yeah. Like I like to hear them because.
Are you gonna make me preach all of the social justice sermons now?
No, I would say I've gotten a little bit more comfortable in my own skin with that. I was downtown Dallas the night of the shootings in Dallas a few years back, so I rewrote my sermon on Saturday, and it happened to be similar themed, but preached about racism as part of this. And it was interesting because I was really inspired preaching it, and but got few comments back about we're not racist, and I said no, I don't think you are. I think it's inherent in our system, and so that was the one time that I felt like really comfortable doing it. But the ones I don't like.
I feel the same.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was answering, but you keep going.
Yeah, I think if I were to answer the one, like I don't mind feeling bad. Like I don't mind somebody calling me out because I constantly want to grow into perfection in God's love. But the ones I don't like hearing are if I were to label them.
This is a hard question to answer. I don't know why I came up with it.
No, it's a good question. Like my first gut reaction is like anybody who says this is the end of the world is like number one on my list of anybody I don't want to listen to. And number two, anybody who like claims to have the absolute authoritative answer on what God would say on something without leaving any room for mystery is that's number two of just I can't sit through that without any humility involved. So Teresa, great to have you here joining us. Thanks for being with us.
So again, I'm a baby in my preaching career, truthfully. But there was one last summer that I did that I was very nervous to give. I don't know if you remember this moment at all. But it was one that I talked about sin. And I talked about this like cycle of sin, and I like called things out. Like I wrote this real punchy sermon. Like I'm sitting at my desk, I'm like, yeah, like this is that. And then like 5 minutes before the first service, I was like, this is terrible. Everyone's gonna hate me. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And like even after that service, I was like, David, like, do I need to change the whole thing before contemporary service? And you were like, no, that was helpful. And it was, what they needed to hear. And that's the sermon that we ended up using for my Board of Ordained Ministry interview, right? Like, and so I think sometimes it's the ones that we're afraid to give that speak to what people need to hear, right? And even in this section in Micah, we're seeing, these people didn't want to hear this, but it's they're not doing good things.
I think the other area that like money usually makes people sensitive, and then when you start talking about sex of any sort, like proper ethical ways of appreciating bodies, and that always gets incredibly awkward because it's just something that nobody likes to talk about. So when you confront them with something, they have to think about it, and that makes them uncomfortable because no one talks about it. And then on the other side of things is it's like the one area people have decided that nobody has any authority, like that God doesn't have any authority over. And we can kind of do whatever we want to. So I think that's,
I think too, that brings a great point of like a lot of my fear as a preacher is I am around so many people who have a really large critique of the church because of sermons that they heard growing up. So like even with like what you're talking about, like with sex or with body image, like so many people my age are not going to church because of what the church taught us about our bodies growing up, right? Like that our bodies were shameful, that our bodies were things to be covered up, and that has created a lot of harm. And so now as a preacher with some of this like postmodern like angsty thought, I don't know how to approach it in a way that I don't want to do what I had modeled for me growing up, or for my friends. But there's no pamphlet right now on how to talk about some of these topics in a way that leaves some room. So that brings out that's a really good point.
Okay. Verse 8 here.
Yep, this is 8. We'll do 8, just 8 and 9. So it says, but you rise up against my people as an enemy. You strip the robe from the peaceful, from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. The women of my people you drive out from their pleasant houses. From their young children you take away my glory forever. So when it says, just for translation points, when it says the women of my people you drive out, this is maybe better translated as the widows in the community you drive out, and then from their young children you take away my glory forever. Children may have better been translated as orphans, and we see particularly with Jesus and Paul and the early church and the prophets, the care for the widow and the orphan, the care for the most isolated in the community. And so what these people are doing, they're not just oppressing the poor, but they are taking away from those who have the least.
James chapter 1, it says like, what is true religion? It's to take care of widows and orphans.
But what's interesting about this section that we see here is we're seeing that the people that rise up in the community that are doing evil are part of the community, right? So the enemy is not coming from outside of the city walls, it's coming from within the city walls. And so I've thought a lot about, we talked a lot about like funny things that church people have like argued or complained about. But what do we do when there are people within our community, whether it's like where we live, like geographically, or even like our church community, like what is like our proper Wesleyan grace-filled response towards evil doers within our community? Because I've seen a lot of church models that I would disagree with how they deal with certain levels of evil doers.
Yeah, that's kind
We're
of
playing bingo with controversy tonight. We should have
right.
made a card.
No, it's just it's one of those things where our theology doesn't always meet our practice, and we have to live with that ambiguity. Because I'm thinking about, if someone is a child molester, we're obviously not going to let them work with children,
right?
But you don't want to exclude them from the grace of God, and if you're saying that the church is the body of Christ on earth, then you don't want to just send them to another church where they don't know the history of that. And so, I'm thinking, there was a situation in Creekwood where someone brandished a gun at the praise team, and different people tried to welcome this person back in, and it ended up driving more people away because they felt unsafe. And so there is a certain amount of, I think you told the celebration class that God's got enough grace for Hitler. And that
was the worst idea I've ever had.
Well, I mean, it's true. I
believe it, but
it's his decision whether to accept that or not. And so we say things like that, and I think we say them and we believe them about God, but in practice, it's hard to live that out because of the, I don't know, just practical nature of keeping, doing no harm.
Right.
So,
well, and the way in which like the nature of the job of pastor is so all encompassing of it's part shepherding, and part of shepherding like is keeping, like in your first example, it's keeping kids and teenagers safe, right? Like that's being a good shepherd. And part of it is, business administration. And so we're having to deal with things like money and like all those really boring stuff that the meetings you don't make me go to yet. And then there's politics within the church where if you do say, I think God might have enough grace for Hitler, and everybody kind of freaks out on you and you have to back that up and explain yourself. And then there's, standing in the receiving line, and Lord knows what can be said to you in the receiving line week to week. So I think it just, again, it's a very simple question that I think a lot of people would have a very simple answer for right up until that person is sitting across your office on the other side of you, and they're a living, breathing human being made in the image of God just as much as you are.
right.
So I've asked a very simple question with a very complicated answer.
Yeah, well, and so Kathy reminded me like this, whatever, I can't remember what the situation was, but in the sermon I said, like, if you do this, I'm going to be the first one to call the police on you, but then I'm going to go visit you in prison. And I'm thinking about, people recently that I've sat through court hearings with, and other people that I've visited in prison who I've been in ministry with before. And, it's the consequences that we have to bear for our actions. But the main thing we have to keep enforcing is that they're not alone. They're in our hearts and they're in God's spirit. And then B, on the flip side of this, doesn't define them in the future. Yeah. So I do think, what I would hold is there's no one who's inherently evil. There are people who make bad decisions because of fallen nature, but there's no one who's always going to be evil. There is always redemption because God's power is so much stronger than evil, and we need to be witnesses of that in appropriate ways.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I'll finish out the reading, and I don't have any questions for the last two sections. So if you come up with anything brilliant you want to ask everyone on the World Wide Web.
So just pay attention to verse 11, y'all, because it's one of my favorite scriptures in all of the Bible.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I actually do have a point of clarification on this. So this is a good moment. Okay. So we'll do actually 10 and 11, then we'll do 12 through 13. So 10 and 11 says, Arise and go, for this is no place to rest because of uncleanliness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If someone were to go about uttering empty falsehoods, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, such a one would be the preacher for this people. Would you like to say why this is one of your favorite verses in the Bible?
It's just one of those ones you can read and people are like, what? That's in the Bible?
Yeah.
But I think, Gay kind of called me out, and I agree with her. She says, preaching about income inequity is, maybe not doing that is a missed opportunity. And, what Micah is saying here is like, this is, you think this is a place to rest because you're being uplifted and told what you want to hear all the time, but really that's the opposite of what you need to hear. And, everybody expects to come here and be told, hey, this is a place for wine and beer. And, I appreciate the beauty of that. And I'm just thinking about the first sermon I ever gave at Creekwood. I was doing a series called First Impressions. So I did Jesus' first miracle of wine and water into wine. And I joked about Franzia and all sorts of stuff. And man, I was speaking everybody's language, talking about wine. And I have nothing against wine. I think it's disgusting. I have nothing against it. And I think Christians can drink alcohol and that's just fine. But basically, I think Mike is sitting here talking about everybody wants their preachers to come in and tell them that everything's just hunky dory and they're all great and, just preach about all the fun things in life without challenging them on the hard things. Yeah. So it's just, I don't know. It's just one of those scripture verses that I think is funny because there are times in which I think people want me to do that. And usually that's when I have to check myself on, okay, what am I listening to? And I think there's totally, I think the Spirit calls us as preachers to uplift people, most of the time. The gospel is an uplifting message, but if all we're giving people is ear candy the entire time, then we're not really challenging them in the way that Jesus did. So
no, I think so. One of my commentaries did not put it this way, but I've taken to understanding it this way. And I talked about this, I think, last week, somewhere in chapter 1. We need a sarcasm font. We've got to have it because right here, verse 11 would be a perfect place to use the sarcasm font because it's basically Micah saying, okay, would you rather have somebody preaching to you whatever the heck you want that's just going to reinforce your lifestyle? Which I think brings up a really interesting point of even in the modern context, the times that we as preachers make you, the listener, uncomfortable, would you rather have somebody who's you're just going to walk away feeling ho-hum mildly okay every single time? Or would you rather be challenged every now and again? And I would say most people, even though they wouldn't admit it, would prefer the challenge every now and again. And also along the lines of preaching wine and strong drink, I've received questions before about my choice of beverage I have for Bible study. It's sparkling water. So that's, just so everybody knows, I'm sponsored by Bubbly as well. But I just don't like a cold can. Disney and Bubbly today. But I don't like a cold can, so I put a koozie on it. But I have had a couple of questions. Are you drinking beer in the middle of Bible study? And the answer is no. That would be a terrible choice.
So. You would not be the first.
I'm sure not in quarantine, but also we keep the lines clear around here. So comment your favorite bubbly flavor because Sean McCafferty, if he's still on, was totally drinking a flavor yesterday on our meeting. So
the sparkling water thing, it's right up there with wine and beer to me. I don't get it. It's put some extra sugar in it and call it Coke and make it good.
Oh my gosh, no, it's so great. I have a great time. We are going through sparkling water in this house about as hard as we're going through double stuffed Oreos right now, which is every Target run. We have both of them in the cart kind of deal. So that's how quarantine's going in my house. This is my third one today.
I had to stop myself a little bit ago because I was thinking the modern day equivalent. I was thinking of obesity. I was thinking the modern day equivalent is just to tell everybody like, hey, it's okay to eat Oreos and Cheetos all the time. And then I remembered like, oh wait, Carrie Lynn's eating Oreos all the time right now.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah.
I got
And
special birthday cake Oreos last week that I still haven't finished though, so I'm proud of myself for having some. But that's only because I had cookie cake and a nothing bundt cake that Wendy hand delivered to my apartment.
yeah,
But we had some. Listen, we're having a great time with dessert around here.
Penny, let me encourage you to grab the beer out of the fridge again. Like,
oh, you can drink and watch Bible study. That's
we're
fine.
not being judgmental here. We're having fun, and like, I think we'd miss the entire point if we were all putting the beer back in the fridge. I'll just tell you, like, after one, maybe don't go for 2 or 3 more, but take the beer out
like
of
a beer during Bible study. If you're watching, you're hanging out having a beer with your pastor. That's the point.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we've gotten way off track. So I'm going to read 12 and 13, and then we'll be done. So, and this is a really interesting section because it's a very small judgment or promise section, but it comes in the midst of a very fascinating judgment point. So it says, I will surely gather all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the survivors of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like flock in its pasture. It will resound the people. The one who breaks out will go forth before them. They will break out and pass the gate, going out by it. Their king will pass on before them, the Lord at their head. So this, the way that I understand it to be interpreted, is that the towns of Judah are gathered up, and some read this to be that they're sent into exile. So it's interesting because even the way that they're gathered up, I read is so pastoral. It's that language of that remind me of Psalm 23 of the Lord is my shepherd. Even the way in which they're going to be sent out of their own city comes from this gentle shepherd who gathers up sheep like a fold and gathers them up in the pasture, and then they're going to be sent out, and they're going out the gate of their city, and they're going to live not where they have been oppressing people and taking their land. And I think that just brings up a really interesting point because these first 2 chapters of Micah and these first couple hours of doing this study, it's hard. It's so hard to talk about this judgment stuff and this social justice stuff all day long, and be Wesleyan and be like, but grace, I promise it's coming. But I think even in this, even in the exile that's coming, the way in which they're gathered up is still language, the same language that's used from such a comforting message from Psalm 23.
Yeah, I think the way it says it will resound with people. I mean, imagine yourself. I mean, I'm thinking about Holocaust Remembrance Day was just a few days ago, and your family gets put on a train, probably separated on this boxcar, and have no idea where you're headed to, no direction whatsoever, and that's how I imagine exile probably felt. Whether it was whatever exile was, Assyrian or Babylonian, and so to have this promise that it's going to be enough people that it's going to resound. And we talked in Philippians a lot about this koinonia of community that really resounds with the Israelite people and the Christian people. So I think there's some extra special imagery in this about we might be separated, but God's going to bring us together again. And if we're together again, then we're the Lord's people, and there's still hope after that.
Yeah, that's really good. So any other thoughts on Micah 2?
Not unless anybody else has some in the comment thread, but no, I appreciate the work you put into this. I appreciate the comments from everybody as we've been journeying along. And just as a warning, as we get into chapter 3 next week, we're getting back into the judgment of this all. So come ready to feel bad again. Penny, bring your beer again since we're going to feel bad. Next week, I'll bring my chocolate milk, and
your chocolate milk.
Oh, that is comfort. That's like nighttime comfort food for me is chocolate milk. I'm such a 4th grader with that. I actually know I know a preacher who every Sunday night drinks like an entire bottle of Promised Land chocolate milk.
Oh my God.
It's like, yeah,
I just take a nap every Sunday.
that's just his thing. So, no, I think we're good to go on Micah chapter 2. We'll be back next week with Micah chapter 3. And Tom, yeah, thanks for joining us. Laura, Penny, everybody, thank you so much for taking this time to dig in a little bit more with us. The Bible has so much wisdom to offer. And I think it's important to, like, when Carrie Lynn mentions they should have a sarcasm font, that's not always easy to tell when you are, when you're reading through it just straight through, especially if you're groggy in the morning. So I'm proud of everybody for reading this along with us to dig into what God is really trying to tell us and how we can reimagine that for how it impacts our lives today. I think we did some good work on that today. So, Jenny Sullivan's going to bring the Oreos. You and Carrie Lynn can have Oreos next week together.
I'm actually kind of afraid when we go back, because I'll quit the Oreos when quarantine's over. I'm a little afraid how many people are going to get me Oreos because I keep talking about them and our people are so nice. So yeah, we'll see.
You know what? If you need to share any of that, we're trying to cut down the sweets because Lindsay hit a baking kick for the first like 2 or 3 weeks of this, which I was fine with. We're working out every day and I'm good, but now she said something today about we have too many sweets in the house as it is, and I'm a little just fearful of that her skills are going to go to waste now.
Oh my goodness. Well,
yeah. All right, y'all.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Y'all are the best.
Yeah, I'm going to go, I think, read a chapter, well, maybe a little bit, maybe not a full chapter of Harry Potter to Kyler, and everybody have a wonderful, wonderful night, and we will see you Sunday and then next Wednesday. So have a good night, y'all.